right, welcome everybody. My name is Larry Moss with Azimuth Consulting, and welcome to our live event today. Where we're going to be talking about crisis proofing your organization. And I'd like to welcome Jeremy, JT, also a partner here with me in Azimuth Consulting. And between the two of us, hopefully we got something good to say. I don't know if you're joining live or you're going to watch the restream. Either way, we hope we add value to you. So, Jeremy, we've been talking about this for a while, and it seems like over the past 5 years or so, like we're constantly in this crisis mode, or something's coming, or we're going through something, or we just came out of something. And one of the things that really resonates with me is how do we help businesses and organizations manage that crisis and actually crisis proof themselves so that it doesn't impact them as much. So I think today we ought to look at number one, what is a crisis? How do we define it? Number two, what does it look like if you're not crisis proof? And then number three, what does it look like when you are, and what can benefits come of that? So welcome, JT. Tell you what, why don't you take the first one? Can you define what is a crisis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know we've had a lot of discussions about this subject, and I would agree with you that, over the last 5 years, it could have been triggered by COVID and then subsequent kind of an evolution of society and maybe some new mindsets. But even before COVID, the idea of the VUCA environment has been a thing. And people have been talking about that for a long time, and different types of disruption, black swan events. There's always change. There's always something going on, and I think that necessarily leads to situations where crisis can occur. And again, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I always love having conversations talking about organizational health and leadership. So I'm excited just to have the chance to talk a little bit about this topic. But to get at your specific question, what is a crisis? I think you can characterize a crisis in a few different ways. One, by definition, it's unpredictable. You don't necessarily see it coming. Can we anticipate different types of crises? Yes, but we never really know when they're going to happen, and in a lot of cases, we don't necessarily see them coming. So they're definitely unpredictable. There's a time factor associated with them. They tend to be very urgent, so we get compressed. Pressure starts to rise because we feel like we have to act, maybe at a tighter decision-making cycle than we might normally do. Clearly, there's a sense of threat. I mean, it's a crisis because there's something on the line. There's some risk that's out there. So it's not just unpredictable and urgent, but there's impact associated with that. So whether that's financial risk, whether that's reputational risk, impact on your people, or just the very survival of your organization. So I think that threat is an inherent part of this. And what we see, perhaps reaching back to what I was talking about earlier with the VUCA environment and the rate of change that's happening in society, is there's complexity, and that complexity can add to the sense of overwhelm, and the sense of confusion and disorientation that crisis can generate. But those are the things that come to mind when I think about a crisis occurring.
No, absolutely. And real quick, I want to define. You heard the term VUCA. JT and I are both come from a military background, and because we can have the tendency to throw out acronyms,
we do
know what that is. So VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Okay, that's basically just chaos and confusion. We don't know what's going on. So how do we manage through that? And one of the crises I think everybody can relate to was COVID. It's been 5 years since it started, and we were in the heights of it, and nobody expected it. It was definitely volatile. There was uncertainty. Nobody knew what was going to happen, where we were going, when we were going to come out. You mentioned the time piece to it. Nobody knew. It was certainly uncertain. So And we've seen where companies thrived, some survived, and others didn't. So, I mean, I was looking the other day for some examples of some that thrived but didn't prepare to carry on, like Peloton. Everybody knows what Peloton is, right? Their sales soared during COVID. Matter of fact, they struggled to meet delivery of the equipment. Well, then what happens when everybody went back to the gym, right? They didn't prepare for it. Now they had a over inventory. How do we get rid of these things? So that was something that they needed to change. And an example of somebody that obviously thrived, where one that came to mind was like Airbnbs. You know, what do you do when you can't rent? Nobody's leaving home, and your livelihood is making sure somebody's in your house. Well, they had to look at longer term stays, right? And we talked about this the other day. Chick-fil-A, you know, how does a restaurant, and I love using Chick-fil-A as an example of success, because not only do they have great chicken, and you know, my youngest son's like, what do you like to eat today? Chick-fil-A. But you know, here you have a restaurant that has a great business model, but if nobody can come in, you can't sell your product. But wait a minute, we still have a drive-through, right? I know one locally here. I met the owner during COVID, and he was telling me that they opened their entire parking lot as drive-throughs. I think they had, let's see, one, two, three, like 5 to 7 lanes that you could go through. So this was a pivot, right? It wasn't something they had planned that, hey, if we ever have a pandemic and have to close the door, we're going to do this. But it showed the ability to think through the process and react quickly. That's the key. It was reacting quickly that had a resilience built in. So now, you know, that particular store, and I'm sure, I think Chick-fil-A showed an increase in revenue during COVID over the years prior to COVID, because they were prepared not for COVID, not for a pandemic, but they were prepared to handle a crisis. So they had crisis-proofed their culture, their organization. So what are some things that you think can happen if we don't crisis-proof ourselves as an organization or business?
Well, I mean, I think some of the examples you gave, and just in terms of failure, you know, when crisis occurs, I'd like to kind of circle back real quick on the Chick-fil-A example. You know, we talked about how they thrived, how they came out on the positive side. You know, there's space in there between the outcome, the action, and the crisis, right? And there's things that happen. There's context for that. And you know, one of the things we've talked about recently is perspective. You know, are you focused on the near term, the now, that, you know, as we say in the military, the tactical fight? You know, or do you have awareness of the bigger picture, the larger goal, the overall purpose of your organization and what you're seeking to strive? And the concept of a healthy organization, which I see as something that has the ability to contribute in a long-term sense. It's adaptive, it's resilient, it's able to grow and to thrive. I think for organizations, ultimately, we want that. We don't just want success in the now. We want to be able to be successful now and into the future. And so there are things that have to be in place that allow you to deal with these crises, you know, these things that occur and emerge not even just as good as you were, but perhaps better.
There you go.
You know, that evolution, growth, you see it as an opportunity. You know, some people will fail, some people will fall, other people will come out stronger because of their ability to adapt and grow. And now they're an even more effective organization. And I think Chick-fil-A is one of those great examples. But what happens in that in between? You know, what does crisis trigger? Well, you got fear. You know, you got the unknown, the uncertainty, and the overwhelm. Like, that's a natural reaction to crisis.
Right.
What's happening? What are we going to do? Oh, there's so much going on. I'm confused. So you're afraid. People become frustrated. I mentioned the confusion. There can be a sense of hopelessness
Mm-hmm.
because what you've grown accustomed to working in this new situation doesn't seem to be working, and the pressure keeps building. So how does that manifest? Well, you start to see communication failure. You start to see leaders who think they're stepping up and they start to take control. They start to micromanage. They start to become more authoritarian and directive in what they do. You see conflict. You see friction. You see trust
Mm-hmm.
drops. You see motivation drops amongst your employees. And you start to see people making short-sighted decisions
Right.
that are actually not in the best long-term interests of organizations. So I think that's just a natural consequence of what can come out of a crisis, especially when people are not maintaining that higher level vision, that strategic approach to making sure that their organization is capable of long-term adaptation and growth and survival.
So what I'd like to do is dive in a little bit here because I heard several things in your commentary there. Number one is organizations need to take advantage of that space between the crisis and the solution. We can call it white space, whatever, but it's being able to see not just that the crisis is something that has to be solved or managed, but that we can grow from, and we see it as an opportunity for growth. So, looking at companies coming out of COVID, a lot of the things that they did while in COVID, they still do. I mean, we look at remote work has increased a lot more. Does it have to be? No, but it can be. It's an option. It's an option for growth for the employees, their growth, but to maintain momentum and save money. I mean, there's tons of benefits. But you mentioned one other thing is the term leader, right? How does a leader show up in this? So what my personal opinion, and we've shared this, I share the same outlook on leadership as John Maxwell. Everything rises and falls on leadership, right? If it succeeds, because you had a great leader. If it fails, because the leader failed somewhere. You can look back and trace it to leadership. So what do leaders need to do in order to ensure they crisis proof not only their organization, but their culture and their people? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, one of my favorite books on leadership, Extreme Ownership, one of the key takeaways from that is there are no bad teams. There are only bad team leaders.
Right.
And so I think what we got to look at beyond the space between the crisis and the reaction is what do we do in military parlance to get left of bang?
Mm.
We know the world is VUCA. We know that change is bound to happen. We know that events are going to show up. They're going to occur. We don't know what they're going to be. We don't know when they're going to be, but we know they're going to happen. And so if you have a larger view, again, you're focused on that long-term health of your organization, you say, this is coming. I need to have vision and I need to invest now to make sure that when this thing happens, we are capable of adapting and responding. We've talked about a number of metaphors. There could be, whether it's body care, whether it's preparing your home for a storm, whether it's doing preventive maintenance on your vehicle, pick any metaphor. Whether that's, say, body care, right? You can drive your body into the ground. You can run hard. And eventually something's going to fail because you haven't done the things you need to do to prepare for long-term success. Making sure your sleep is on point, making sure you're managing your stress. Your nutrition is good. You're taking time for those relationships that set a foundation for kind of meaning in life. So exercise, there's so many different things that we do individually. And I feel like we lose sight of that when we're considering our organization, because our organizations are organic. They're entities. They're collections
Absolutely.
of people that have to be maintained in the same way. So what sorts of things, I think, to answer your question, allow organizations to prepare, to have that larger vision, to get left of bang? I see maybe three primary areas that I would offer for consideration, and we've talked about these operationally. How do you do preparation for crisis operationally? Part of it is, call it, as we call it in the military, wargaming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do we think might happen? What are some of the scenarios that we've seen that have occurred? I mean, it's not completely unknown. I mean, the idea of true black swans, those don't happen that often. Right. And really, because of the nature of what the definition of a black swan event is, it's an unknown. You can't prepare for a black swan by definition. But there are lots of crises that, as they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So you can see things that
Mm-hmm.
might be coming, that you are likely to face. And so think about, what are those scenarios? What are effective ways of addressing those things? What are some good playbooks or standing operating procedures that we can put in place that allow us to have checklists, processes when something occurs, so that we're not in the midst of this overwhelm, the midst of this fear and uncertainty, we're not adding to the confusion because we don't know what to do. We've at least got something that we can reference, and I know no plan survives first contact, but there's value in planning and having a base to operate from. Nobody wants to have zero plan. They want to have something to adjust from. So I think operationally, having tools, exercises, making sure that people have experience exercising those standing procedures and learning from them, and kind of doing after actions to say, hey, this is how we could better respond to these types of crises. So there's some experience, there's some awareness there.
Right.
That's operationally.
So let's pause there for a second, because one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about this, I know we talked about COVID and black swan events, and everybody can relate to that based on their experience, but something that happens all the time, all around us. And I look at the loss of connectivity, data, and proprietary information. The threat to that is huge, and it's no longer a possibility. I have to plan for that, and so many organizations don't. They take their cybersecurity programs, they don't take it seriously. Insider threat programs, they don't have them. Things that we saw in the military, because we have a different lens at which we look at the threat than corporate America does. But I read an article a few weeks ago talking about the loss of downtime for, say, I think it was $88,000 an hour on average is what's lost during a downtime, and less than, was it around 2%? 2% of companies are actually able to recover within 60 minutes. 2%. So you're talking $88,000 lost, right? Because you couldn't recover in 60 minutes. That's the majority. 98% of companies don't. And yet, in that same scenario, it was quoted that 96% of organizations that have some type of resiliency plan and have practiced it, 96% of them fully recover. So that's a huge difference. And to me, a signpost that says, build your resilience, crisis-proof your organization, because it's not a matter of if, it's when this is going to happen.
You're saying it works, and I think there's certainly evidence there. Some of the examples that, maybe circling back a little bit about what can happen, what can go wrong, and for folks that are like, oh, well, COVID only happens once, I don't know, we'll see how how often that happens, but those true crisis events are unlikely, and we'll figure it out. But those statistics are clear that the impact is not only substantial but can be catastrophic if you don't take that perspective. But things like an ethical failure, a natural disaster, an accident, something happens in your workplace, competition, disruptive technology. Those things are happening all the time. Right. And think that those are not somehow going to touch your organization at some point, I think is very short-sighted. And again, is not taking that long-term organizational health perspective that we advocate for.
So let's take a look. We've defined what a crisis is, both from a black swan standpoint and just everyday crisis that's going to happen. And and you mentioned fear, and that's typically the first response, because our brain, that's the way it works, right? It's the way we were built. It's our mind, our brain protects itself. So if I hear a noise in the woods, the first thing is like, what was that? And it transfers all of the energy to focusing on protection. And if we stay there, then we can tend to move forward blindly, and we don't see opportunities. And what I want to do is, let's talk a little bit about what it is when we utilize, if we built this capability and we've crisis proof, now we move away from the emotional response to the crisis, and we're actually looking at, okay, how do we thrive while we're here, and what does it look like to get better when we come out, and use that. Hindsight's the greatest teacher, but only if reflected on, right? I can know what I did wrong, but if I don't stop and go, how do I make that change, then it serves no value to the future. For example, what was it, 2011 with the tsunamis in Japan? Okay, some things that Toyota recognized was that we need to diversify our supply chain, right? Because if all of our stuff's coming from this area and a tsunami hits us again, then we're dead in the water. So after that, they geographically diversified to where it wouldn't stop operations, like you said, during a crisis, because I have other options. But so how do we get there? What does it look like to be a crisis-proof organization?
Yeah, I mean, a few things came to mind when you were talking. In combat, we talk about it's a competition, right? And in the business world, there's competition. You talk about decision cycles. We have the phrase, the OODA loop, right? It's a form of decision cycle: observe, orient, decide, act. And that's conceived of as a cycle of decision making. And in the chaos and uncertainty of competition, in a military environment, the person that can cycle faster, can decide faster, can act faster and learn, tends to have an advantage. And there's some more nuance to that could be a whole nother podcast about what it means to orient, and the importance of clarity and how you observe what's going on and what you take from that. But I think having the things in place, you use Toyota. I mean, it's great to learn from experience, right? And I'm a big fan and managing information so that we're but it's better to learn from the experience of others, because you don't have to endure the consequences.
Absolutely.
I've endured. So again, if you've got
I see you get hit in the face, I'm not going to go over there and stand in front of the guy that hit you.
Running into that wall over and over and over again, right? So I think when you've got that longer term perspective, you can start to look at history and say, hey, what sorts of things could come up? And it goes back to that operational component of crisis proofing your organization. Mm-hmm. What are you doing operationally to make sure that you can see these things coming, you can anticipate, and your people know what's the playbook? How do we respond to these situations? Because that helps build confidence too. When you've been through, you've war gamed, you've practiced, you've experienced, you said, oh, yeah, maybe I haven't seen this specific situation, but I've been through something like it. That's the confidence that comes from maturity and wisdom, from
Right.
through adulthood. It's like, oh yeah, I've seen something like this before. It may not be exactly the same, but I've been through it. So now there's calmness, there's collection, there's an ability to think clearly. So I think that operational side is important, but there are two other key components that we are, I think, big advocates for. It's your culture
Mm.
and your leader competence.
Yes.
So those are all elements of the larger organization. But again, having that big long-term perspective on your ability to adapt and grow and thrive requires understanding of the role that culture plays in an organization. And the reality is culture exists.
Whether you like it or not.
It's
by default or design.
Right. I don't remember, the name escapes me, but you say you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, right?
Right.
Thing with culture, like it's going to happen. It's going to have an impact. Are you going to choose to ignore it because you're focused on fighting fires every day and staying in the tactical fight? Or are you going to say, hey, I need a longer term perspective. I need to invest in things now that I know are going to make my organization resilient and adaptive when these inevitable crises occur, or frankly, when these opportunities show up.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view the crisis? If you can adapt faster, if you can respond to a situation, if you're prepared, if you can keep your head when everybody else is losing theirs, there's opportunity there for you to grow and succeed and gain an advantage during that crisis. But that only happens when you take that larger perspective that includes understanding your culture is important, and then understanding that leadership at every level matters.
Yes.
You could be the world's best leader at the top of an organization, but you cannot control what happens at the lowest level of the organization. That's something that people start to learn. The longer they're in leadership positions and the higher they rise in the hierarchy is you have to lead through people.
Right.
And your ability to lead through people is only as good as the leadership competence of those people at every level. If you do not invest in them, then you're limiting your own ability to influence and impact your organization. So crisis proofing, I believe, involves the operational components, the culture development, and then the intentional growth and development of people, your leaders at every level. And I would also throw out followers. At some point, people have to know how to follow.
You can't cross the barrier into leadership unless you knew how to follow at some point. And
absolutely.
Absolutely, and I love what you had to say there, and that's the purpose of this live event and the following. We're going to do this every week for the next 6 weeks or so, and it's leading up to a workshop that we're going to be putting on crisis proofing your organization, and we're going to go. We're giving you little samples of what we're going to talk about, and then we're going to go a little deeper into that 3-hour workshop. More to follow on that if you're interested, because we're being very selective of who we allow in, because we want to make sure that you truly are interested and invested in crisis proofing your organization. But for the next 6 weeks, we're going to be doing one of these live events, trying to keep them around a half an hour. If you'd like to know more about what's coming, you can drop us an email. You can DM me here in LinkedIn, and we'd be more than happy to get you on the schedule. So next week, I'm going to be bringing in someone to talk about building those processes and systems inside your organization, right? Because a lot of times we do things routinely because that's just the way we've done it. But what if I lose somebody that was the expert in that? How do I make sure the organization keeps going? That requires SOPs, written and documented processes. All those things, I don't know about you, JT, but I hate doing, but I know that needs to be done. So I'm going to bring somebody in to tell us how to do that. She loves doing it, and so I look forward to next week. So again, if you want any more information on what's coming, drop us a line, DM me, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And if you got any questions, let us know. Thanks, JT.
Thanks, Larry. A pleasure.